Good day. An article has appeared in the New York Times which suggests that some people within the US government are apparently now considering that in the event of a Russian-Ukrainian conflict ending in the conquest, the defeat of the Ukrainian military, and Russia gaining control or conquering, if you prefer, large areas of Ukraine, or perhaps even the entirety of Ukraine, that the United States and its NATO allies could organize some kind of insurgency in Ukraine, providing sanctuary to these insurgents in EU territory, in countries like Slovakia, Romania, and Poland, providing them with medical help, weapons systems, organizing them in some sort of conflict, some sort of prolonged, protracted conflict against Russia, to try to increase for Russia the supposed costs of its occupation of Ukraine. Well, can I say straight away that this is a demented idea? It is one of the worst ideas I have ever heard, and the very fact that it is being floated shows the extent of the bankruptcy of the US in terms of military options in response to any action that Russia might decide to take in Ukraine. I say that because an insurgency of this kind, sponsoring this kind of insurgency in a critically important country in Europe, could only have disastrous consequences which would rapidly backfire on the United States itself. Now, before I proceed further, can I say that the United States obviously has form in this matter. It has sponsored insurgencies against various countries at various times. Way back in the 1980s, I can remember, for example, how the United States was sponsoring an insurgency against the Sandinista government in Nicaragua, the so-called Contras. And of course, that did eventually backfire on the United States, or at least on the politicians who were sponsoring that insurgency, because the whole story of how that insurgency was being funded came out into the open. It provoked the so-called Iran-Contra scandal, and that caused a major scandal that for a time seriously weakened the administration of Ronald Reagan. So that's one example. Some people in the US might, of course, say that in the short term, at least, it did result in war weariness amongst the Nicaraguan population. The election victory of Violeta Chamorro, who was the opponent of the Sandinistas, and for a time an anti-Sandinista government, did eventually establish itself in Nicaragua. However, that was, as it turned out, only a temporary affair, and the Sandinistas and their leader, Daniel Ortega, are firmly in charge in Nicaragua today. And then, of course, the United States did something very similar in Afghanistan. And it's quite interesting reading this article in the New York Times, how people like General Stavridis, for example, retired General Stavridis, are playing up the Afghanistan example when the United States sponsored an insurgency against the Soviet military in Afghanistan. I have to say that the fact that people like General Stavridis and other US officials seem to be touting Afghanistan as an example of how to do this, and talking about the whole affair in Afghanistan as a success, strikes me as utterly extraordinary, to the point of being bizarre. I say that because, of course, the blowback from that insurgency that the United States sponsored in Afghanistan has been completely disastrous for the United States. It provided Islamist terrorist groups with a terror base in Afghanistan that they used to launch attacks on the United States. The United States, rightly in my opinion, claimed that these terrorist groups were responsible for the 9/11 attacks. That in turn resulted in a US occupation in Afghanistan, which only last summer ended in a disastrous debacle. One would have thought that the lesson of Afghanistan is not to do this sort of thing again. And yet, here we are, just a few months later, and there are some people who want to do a rerun, only this time in Europe. And then, of course, there's been another case, even closer to Russia's home, which is, of course, the Caucasus. Now, as many of you no doubt know, the Russians had to fight a prolonged war against various insurgent groups in the Caucasus, centered on the Republic of Chechnya. And specifically, they initially had to fight a secular secessionist movement led by a Chechen nationalist called Dzhokhar Dudayev, and eventually that morphed into a jihadi insurgency with a Islamic emirate being established in the northern Caucasus, which fought Russia for a very long time. However, a number of things about that war, I suspect, are not particularly well known. Firstly, there is now, I think, a general acceptance that the insurgents who were fighting in in Chechnya, in the Caucasus, Dudayev's forces, subsequently jihadi fighters, were getting support from the United States and from NATO allies, most importantly, of course, from Turkey. And so this was an instance of the United States, in effect, backing an insurgency on Russia's own territory. And what eventually happened is that insurgency eventually burnt itself out. It eventually turned the local people against the insurgents, and it enabled the Russians to consolidate control of Chechnya and of the northern Caucasus, win a decisive victory there, and it has, of course, established the Russians not just as the dominant force in the Caucasus altogether, but it has also discredited amongst many Chechens any idea of aligning with the United States. This is an aspect of the story which many people in the West I know are not familiar with, but which I have been able to confirm with various people, including academics, who have actually studied the subject. So these operations, these ideas of running insurgencies against Russia, what they have invariably done is that they have achieved, in effect, the opposite of their intended purpose. In Afghanistan, they created a massive problem and headache for the United States. In Chechnya, they did the same. Nowhere that they have been attempted can one say that they've really been much of a success. And as I said, it is bizarre that just a few months after the fall of Kabul, there are people in the United States who are looking to revive that kind of disastrous idea. But let's now take a step back and let's put all that aside and let's actually analyze this whole idea. First of all, is the idea of an insurgency in Ukraine even a practical one? Ukraine is a profoundly different country from Afghanistan, from Chechnya, from all of these sort of places. No doubt there are many Ukrainians today who are trained to fight, but one wonders how many of them would want to do so. As was pointed out by someone who was asked to comment to this New York Times article, this person pointed out that there's been attempts to try to stir up resistance to the Russians in Crimea, and that has not achieved anything, actually. And by the way, the same is true in the two breakaway republics of the Donbass. There have been various attempts at various times to try to create some kind of insurgency within these two breakaway republics. There have been assassinations, which most people believe, rightly I am sure, were carried out by the Ukrainian secret services, no doubt with help and assistance from Western secret services. They managed to murder quite a few of the militia leaders in the Donbass, but that has not helped the underlying objectives, and the two Donbass republics appear to be more stable than they have previously been, and as antagonistic to Ukraine as always, and there is no real sign of an insurgency there. To be straightforward about it, I think if the Russians were to confine any, shall we say, reconquest of Ukraine to the territories east of the Dnieper River, to places like Odessa, Kharkov, Nikolaev, Kherson, Zaporozhye, all those sort of places, I doubt that they would meet much resistance, and I doubt there would be much success in organizing some kind of partisan or insurgent war there. I think that the overwhelming majority of people in these places or speak Russian. I think on balance, if anything, they would probably, if not welcome the arrival of the Russians, but I think they would rapidly accept that they are there and rapidly absorb themselves or assimilate themselves into the larger Russian population. They've never been at all supportive of the Maidan program, and after all, they supported previously President Yanukovych, the leader that the Ukrainian nationalists overthrew in the events of 2014, which the Russians characterized as a coup. And of course, they also overwhelmingly supported the current Ukrainian president, Volodymyr Zelensky, when he promised to achieve peace with Russia and seemed to suggest that he was prepared to move in the direction of acknowledging the concerns of Russian speakers in Ukraine. So I doubt that there would be very much resistance in these places. One city that might be an exception in this area is the city which is now called Dnipro, but which most Russians still refer to, I believe, by their previous name, which is Dnipropetrovsk, the former home city, by the way, of the former Soviet leader Leonid Brezhnev. Now, there is a division in Dnipropetrovsk. There is a large Russian-speaking community. There's a large Ukrainian-speaking community. And amongst that Ukrainian-speaking community, there are some apparently very fervid Ukrainian nationalists. And at one time, at least, it was known to be very much the place where Right Sector, this far-right organization that has played an outsized role in Ukrainian politics, had a presence. So it might be possible to organize some kind of resistance in Dnipropetrovsk, at least in theory. But I'm going to say again, I think that is extremely unlikely. I think that there might be some people in Dnipro or Dnipropetrovsk who might want to create trouble for the people they would call the Russian occupiers. But I have to say, I think the most likely outcome of any Russian occupation of the city is that most of the people who would be expected to oppose the Russians there would leave. And by the way, I think this would be true of most of central Ukraine also. This is the area west of the Dnieper River, the area which includes Kiev, which was formerly part of the Russian Empire, and of course also of the Soviet Union, but excluding Western Ukraine, the former Ukrainian territory, the former of the Habsburg Empire, which went under the name of Galicia, which is again a different place altogether. Now, I accept that there are probably some people in this region who would be upset and angry if the Russians were to return, and there might be some opposition also in Kiev, but the capital were the Russians indeed to occupy it. Though I think it's worth saying that up to the time of the fall of the Soviet Union, as I understand it from people who went to Kiev and knew the place, most of the people in Kiev at that time spoke Russian. It was a pretty Russian city, and very few people who lived there ever imagined that they would find themselves in a country separate from Russia. But of course that was 30 years ago. No doubt perhaps things have changed. But again, I have to say frankly, I think the idea that some kind of partisan war or insurgency could be successfully waged in Kiev, some kind of militia or terrorist group could operate there to cause trouble for the Russians. I have to say, I think people who talk in this way are simply not realistic about the realities. First of all, Ukraine has already lost a very large proportion of its young people who have already emigrated from the country to work in the West, and some of them, of course, also in Russia. I think that there is, to say it straightforwardly, a lack of the kind of fiery, passionate young people in Ukraine that you would need to conduct this kind of insurgency. And besides, the overwhelming sense that I get is that Ukraine anyway, most people in Ukraine are tired and exhausted and cynical, and I can't really see many of them coming together and waging this kind of insurgency, even in Kiev and even in various other places. And of course, the geography of the country makes it difficult. I mean, Chechnya, Afghanistan, very mountainous regions, countries that were underdeveloped in some ways. Communications were difficult, very easy for people to hide. That simply isn't true in Ukraine. It's a huge place, large areas of forest, but realistically, I can't imagine that in what is, after all, nowadays, a fairly developed European society, it would be possible to operate successfully any kind of insurgency war. As a matter of fact, if we go back in time to the period of the Second World War, it's a striking fact that the Germans found that it was fairly easy to occupy most of Ukraine because, as I said, the geography made the territory there difficult for an insurgency to take hold, and that most of the partisan war that they faced was in places like Belarus, in the areas of places like the Pripyat marshes further north, those sort of places, they turned out to be much more difficult to control. And of course, it's likely that there are going to be many people in central Ukraine who will support the Russians anyway. After all, they are co-religionists, they're also Orthodox, most of them, except the authority of the Russian Patriarch, and many of them anyway have historic and cultural connections with Russia. An insurgency in Ukraine would in effect be a civil war, setting Ukrainians against each other as well as Ukrainians against Russians. And that would probably mean, by the way, that any insurgents, any attempted partisans would find that they had little support from much of the population, and that any insurgent group would be very quickly infiltrated by Russian intelligence operations, which are extremely sophisticated and very well organized in central Ukraine. I'm going to say this, even in the western area of Ukraine, the part of Ukraine which is most passionately anti-Russian, I suspect that it would be much more difficult it would remain difficult to activate and sustain a successful insurgency there. I mean, there are more people there who feel fervently about these things, who feel passionate about these kind of matters, and who might be willing to launch some kind of resistance campaign against the Russians. But this is, in truth, a relatively small area. A number of people there are not that many. I think the Russians would quickly swamp the area and probably bring it under control. And again, my own sense is that most of the people would leave. But, of course, there is, even if we allow for all of that, even if we allow for the fact that it will be very difficult to organize, to run an insurgency war, even in western Ukraine, let alone central Ukraine, or even more difficult still, eastern Ukraine. But let's assume that you nonetheless try to do it. You could always find some people, perhaps not large numbers of people, but there are always some people in every country who are drawn to this sort of thing, who are fervid or passionate or fanatical, as you like, who are determined to sort of fight against the Russians, who to liberate their country as they would see it. The trouble is that what that would amount to would be infiltrating small groups of people across the border into Russian-controlled Ukraine. Already there's references in this very same article in the New York Times to the possibility that the Russians could build a wall to make it extremely difficult for people to cross into Ukraine that way. And I think that would be actually quite likely. But let's assume that you tried to do it. Let's assume that the Russians didn't build that sort of wall. My own personal view is that the kind of actions that these people would take, essentially terroristic actions, which, as I said, would affect Ukrainians themselves, what they might quite easily do is turn much of the Ukrainian population against the resistance and ultimately against the West, and look to the forces of authority in Moscow to protect them from people that the Russians and many local people might say were terrorists. But let's just go beyond that. Let's ask ourselves what sort of people these would be. They would be extremely violent people, because anybody who gets involved in a resistance movement of this kind, almost by definition, is somebody who's prepared to engage in quite ruthless violence. I should say that in Greece, I've come across people who fought in the partisan wars of the 1940s, and I have noticed the kind of effect that it's had on them and the kind of brutalizing effect such a thing can have. These sort of people are incredibly difficult to control. And how would European Union countries respond to what would in effect be terrorist bases? Because that's inevitably what they would become. How would they respond to terrorist bases like that being organized on their territories? How would the people of these countries feel about that? How would they feel about the fact that the war, the Ukrainian war, was now being waged from their territories, that it is being extended to them? How would people in Poland and Slovakia and Romania feel about harbouring people like this? Moreover, there's a high chance that establishing these bases in these countries would invite Russian retaliation. Why not? After all, the Russians can send people across the border just as easily, presumably, as the Western powers could. That would, I think, create a whole new range of tensions in these countries. And given, as I said, that we're talking about violent men, it's quite likely too that there would be splits in these terrorist groups or insurgent groups or resistance groups. That's what's happened in all of the wars all of the insurgencies that the United States has backed, the United States would find itself constantly trying to broker agreements between these terrorist groups, these young fighters. Many of them would turn, no doubt, to fighting against each other. That's, again, baked in the cake. I've seen it happen in many places. I've seen it happen in Ireland, for example, between the various Republican groups. And all of this being played out on the territory of countries like Slovakia, Romania, and Poland. I have to say that this is a completely ludicrous idea. And what about all these weapons that these people would be supplied with? These Javelin missiles, these Stinger anti-aircraft missiles. Well, give weapons like that to dangerous men, and obviously those weapons can go to all sorts of places. They can find their place in all kinds of places. I can remember after the Afghan wars of the 1980s, the extraordinary concern the United States had about the Stinger handheld anti-aircraft missiles that it had supplied to the Afghan Mujahideen, and its desperate attempts to try to find all of these missiles which it had supplied to them because of concerns that these missiles might be used in an improper and reckless way. And indeed, if we come to that, is it not at least possible that they might be used in an improper and reckless way? Could it not be the case, for example, that if you supply people like that with Stinger anti-aircraft missiles, that they start targeting civilian aircraft? It's happened. Or alternatively, that they could start raiding embassies, Russian embassies in Europe. How would Western governments, European governments, start to feel about that? This is a recipe. It is, if you like, almost inevitable that if you tried an operation of this kind, all you would do is that you would spread the Ukrainian conflict into the heart of the European Union. You would create chaos and fighting, and you would, between these groups, you would have terrorist incidents. Sooner or later, even the most anti-Russian governments, like say those of Poland or the Baltic states or Romania, would say enough and would call time. And in the meantime, all kinds of problems would arise. And of course, the other aspect is that when violent men have arms and are not operating within any kind of military structure that imposes any kind of real discipline upon them, some of them again inevitably start to turn towards criminal activities, towards bank raids, drug trafficking, you name it. Again, if we go back to those wars that the United States waged in Central America with the Contras that I was talking about, and not just the Contras, but some of these El Salvadorian groups and some of these Colombian militias that were used to fight pro-Soviet insurgencies or militia groups in all of these countries. What happened is that as the wars eventually petered out, these people didn't just disappear. Many of them turned to criminal activities, to criminal violence, in some cases to drug trafficking and even worse things. Well, as I said, this is a ludicrous idea. It is a disastrous one. I hope that European governments, if they're hearing about this, are now talking to the United States and telling them, not on our territory. This isn't going to work. It's not going to shake Russian control of Ukraine if that's what happens, if that's how this thing plays out. On the contrary, it is more likely to consolidate it and to turn the local people against us. What it is more likely to do is it's going to bring all sorts of violent people into our midst and equip these violent people with weapons. And we're going to have violent people like that roaming in the heart of the European Union, in European capitals, able no doubt to take advantage of the absence of border controls within the European Union, able to travel to all sorts of places, from Slovakia, say, to Prague or Berlin or Paris or Barcelona, get in contact, perhaps, if they feel aggrieved enough, with terrorist groups or insurgent groups, if you prefer to call them that, in places like the Basque Country, Corsica, you name it, and in effect create another problem, a problem within the European Union itself, such as has never existed before. And as I said, that isn't even bringing into the picture the very real danger of Russian retaliation. I would finish by saying one thing, which is that, of course, in the old days, it was a well-established principle that sending an armed man across a border was an act of war. And the Russians could argue, in response to these kind of activities, that they have a right to take action in self-defense against the countries that host these so-called bases, that they would have a right to act against the sanctuaries in places like Slovakia, Poland, Romania, and the rest. Now, they had the similar right, obviously, against Pakistan during the Afghan wars, against Turkey to a great extent, in terms of the wars in the Caucasus. They were very, very careful not to exercise it too overtly. But it's always, it seems to me, rather dangerous to count on the other side's restraint. What if a less self-possessed leadership were to come to power in Moscow? What if a leadership were to come to power that said it's absolutely unacceptable that the United States and its NATO allies should have these kind of bases on their territories, so let's launch cross-border raids in retaliation against them. After all, that's what the United States often does. That's what Israel regularly does. Israel launches attacks on Syria pretty much by the day against what it likes to call terrorist groups. And if the Russians felt the same way, well, they have the means to do it. They have long-range cruise missiles. They could launch missiles against what they call terrorist bases. And then what does the United States do? As I said, this is an absurd idea. It is the idea of a lunatic. It shows the extent to which the United States, in practical military terms, is out of options when it comes to Ukraine. This whole idea of organizing and orchestrating some kind of partisan war in Ukraine is a dangerous, a reckless nonsense. And I hope that wiser councils in both the United States and the European Union will prevail and will eventually argue the United States out of this folly. Now, I say that, it has to be said that it does appear that this is something that the United States is seriously contemplating. There are rumors that the US Defense Secretary, Lloyd Austin, has warned his Russian opposite number, Sergei Shoigu, that this is what the United States would do in the event of a Russian invasion of Ukraine. And there are also perhaps rather stronger reports that the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Milley, has given the same sort of warning to General Gerasimov. I doubt that either Shoigu or Gerasimov are impressed by these warnings. On the contrary, they will surely see them as further confirmation that the United States has no serious military options in Ukraine, given that it is scraping to the bottom of the barrel and coming up with these reckless and dangerous ideas. But I hope that when Austin and Milley spoke to Shoigu and Gerasimov in this way, what they were actually doing was bluffing, and that there is no real plan or intention in the United States to launch this sort of operation. What I would say is that if I'm wrong about that, and heavens knows, chances probably are that I am, and that this crazy idea is intended fully seriously, all I would say is this: it won't just end with a debacle in Ukraine itself. This kind of operation wouldn't just fail in terms of Ukraine. Extending the Ukrainian conflict into the heart of Europe, into the heart of the EU, having armed men wandering around EU territory, doing, well, who knows what mayhem. Well, the only thing that is going to do is it's going to sow doubts within European governments about the wisdom of the United States and its rationality as an ally. And who knows, perhaps in time, if this becomes serious enough, it might even cause some of those European governments to question the entire value of NATO. This is a disastrous idea. It seems that Biden himself hasn't signed off to it. Reading the New York Times article, it seems that there are some people who are pushing back against it. I hope that this foolish, reckless, misguided, ridiculous idea is dropped. Well, thank you for joining me again today for this program. I look forward to you joining me again soon on future programs on this channel and on our main channel, The Duran, where I do programs with my colleague and friend Alex Christoforou. And please remember to join us on our other platforms, first and foremost Locals, where we have a thriving community, where we publish exclusive content, increasing amounts of exclusive content, where I do live streams every Wednesday at 1400 hours EST and 1900 hours London time, and where our community, also many of our community, those who choose to become active members, also publish exclusive content. And of course, you can also support us if that's what you wish to do. Firstly, by checking us out on our various other platforms, BitChute, Library, Rumble, Odyssey, SuperU, and all the rest. There's apparently lots of others now. We also have Duran TV, where you can see all our videos pretty much back to back. They're all published there. And of course, you can support us if you wish to support us and think that we deserve your support via Patreon and Subscribestar, links under this video. And of course, you can go to our shop, support us, buy also these wonderful things that you will find there, our magic mugs, our hats, hoodies, our sweatshirts, our t-shirts, all of them, I should say. We've made a point of ensuring that they're all of excellent quality, and we have immensely positive free feedback from our viewers who buy them. And last but not least, you can support me by pressing the like button to this video if you've liked this video, and by checking your subscription to this channel. Thank you for joining me again today. More from me soon. Until then, have a very good day.